let's get started. I am your professor, Todd Yarbrough. This is Economics 106, Principles of Economics, Microeconomics, which is a wordful, but all of that to say, this is the one of two classes that you will take as a sequence known as Principles of Economics, Microeconomics, this course, and Macroeconomics, which is Economics 105. Some of you have probably taken that course or have yet to take that course. So, you know, there's no benefit necessarily to taking that course. But if you have taken the course, you know, you might be, let's say, philosophically more situated than other students. So a little bit about myself before we jump in. I have been at Pace University now for 3 years, starting my 4th year in the fall. I received my Ph.D. from the University of Tennessee in 2013. Primary focus of my research is in public finance, mostly state and local fiscal budgeting issues, as well as environmental economics. Recent research that I have looks at the fiscal consequences of natural disasters on U.S. states, and other research I have looks at the influence of things like balanced budget rules, tax and expenditure limits, debt limits, as well as rainy day funds on state level fiscal decisions. So I'm very much a policy-oriented economist, and I think you'll see that come through the course, maybe more so than you might if you took the course from someone who's less focused on policy. I think that will be interesting because it helps us to place a lot of the economic issues that we will discuss at length and talk about them in terms of their real-world ramifications, which is certainly a place where we want to make sure that economics is kept. Economics has historically been accused of playing too much into the theoretical side of economic issues and not doing enough sort of quote unquote looking at the real world. A lot of that has changed in the last 40 to 50 years. Economics has really experienced a sea change from going from majority theory to now being majority empirical economics. In fact, myself, I'm what you would call an applied economist. I do very little theoretical work, and almost all of my work is empirically driven. That is data-driven, statistical economic analysis. And we'll talk a little bit about the distinguishing features between between theoretical and empirical economics. And then throughout the course, we will present both. So I will, discuss with you a theoretical way to look at a particular issue and then look at the predictions that are made by that theoretical construct, and then look at the data-driven research to see if indeed the model performs well. And again, a lot of what we do in this course is about equipping you with various economic ways to think, various ways to frame economic issues as a way to make it more interesting to you, but more importantly, to make it practical to you, so that you can take economics and then take it into other classes, and then certainly take it on into your career and have it be very useful to you. I have often had students tell me, years after the fact of taking my course, and these are non-economics majors as well, how much they think about their economics course and how much the economics that they learn seems to sort of seep into their everyday thought process, which, I don't, I have no reason to distrust them, because I think as you take the course, you'll really see, and I think that I've structured the course in a way, especially to prove in a way how useful economics can be to how we think about even everyday decision making. The truth is that economics is a very important discipline, but no more important, of course, than any of the other disciplines out there. It is one way, or I should say one particular voice amongst a lot of voices that should have their say as it pertains to social decisions. But within that, I think that economics has a particular role as it sort of extends to, how can we make the economic system be useful to us? And in order to do that, we have to understand how the economic system works. In the late 50s and late 60s, you had a bunch of physicists, people who got Ph.D.s in physics and mathematics, who were drawn into the economics discipline because many people realized that you could look at economics and you could look at it from almost a scientific perspective. Whereas in physics you may consider atoms and neutrons and electrons and so on and so forth. In economics, you can consider, human decision making, whether that's within the context of economic markets or whether that's in the context of voting, and that you could analyze their decision making much in the same way that we have done in physics. And like physics, we can then, after the fact, check to see if our theories align with the actual human behavior that we see around us. And so when you think about economics, and the way that I want you to sort of think about economics in this particular course is that economics is an attempt to explain how markets behave, how humans, what we might call the consumers of a market, how the producers, the firms of a market behave, and how that behavior and how the incentive structures and how the dynamics may play out in the real world. And how those instances may be very beneficial to society at large, or maybe sometimes those instances have detrimental effects to markets, in the context of, for example, like income inequality or environmental pollution, amongst the other particular issues. And so the truth is that economics has really become this extremely broad discipline where we look at all sorts of issues, education, healthcare, international trade, monetary policy, fiscal policy. You name it, economics is probably doing work in it. The economics of crime has been a very important topic of recent, given all that's going on, and our reanalysis of the legal state, as it were, and how we want to think about dealing with criminal issues going forward and reforms to the justice system and all those sorts of things. Economics is firmly implanted in those conversations. And I think in this course, you will see why. Because I think what you'll see in this course is how economics really attempts to sort of peel back the onion of human decision making and really understand each layer and understand why is it that humans can be incentivized in ways that are very predictable, or, as we often find out, why is it that in other circumstances it's actually very hard to predict human behavior. And in fact, some people, or at times individuals, behave almost polar opposite of what you expect them to, or what your economic models would suggest. So that'll be a lot of what we talk about in this course, is sort of setting up general frameworks to understand the world around us, to better understand what's going on, and then hold those models up to empirical scrutiny and analyze whether there are holes in the theory. Sometimes theory isn't necessarily bad because it doesn't explain 100% of an issue. Theory gets you most of the way there. Then what you can then turn to is, well, what is it about our assumptions? We'll talk about assumptions later on. What is it about our assumptions, perhaps, that cause the theory to not quite get this particular thing right? So, really a lot of what this course ends up being about is how to think about the theoretical constructs of human decision-making. And then what we will do is we'll inform ourselves of pertinent research that looks at those particular questions. And I think what you'll have is a really nice, well-rounded economics education, not solely based in theory, but really a blend between theoretical and empirical economics. One of the things that we want to talk about sort of right off the bat is that there is this dichotomy in economics that has over time become much more muddy, and certainly will be fairly muddy in this particular course, and that is the distinguishing of positive economic analysis and what we'll call normative economic analysis. Historically, economists had a sort of dogma towards only looking at economic issues from a so-called positive perspective, which is to sort of look at issues as they are and kind of see economic outcomes as being byproducts of economic circumstances, no more, no less. So, for example, if you had extreme income inequality, historically speaking, economists sort of tended to say, well, that's just kind of how the market works. There's not really a whole lot that you could or necessarily should do about it, right? There was sort of a hyper focus on, markets and whatever outcomes they tended to produce. There was a tendency of economists to say, well, that's the outcome that we get. This has evolved over time. And so from issues like income inequality, wage inequality, racial bias in policing, to, issues like pollution issues, environmental degradation issues, so on and so forth. And we'll cover a lot of these issues in the course. These have maybe historically been seen as normative issues, but increasingly are moving into the sort of mainstream kind of economic paradigm that we see today. As an example of this, a sort of attempt at normative analysis would be the rent is too damn high. Okay, so if those of you don't know, this individual ran for public office a number of years ago. He ran as the rent is too damn high party. And at first his statement sounds like it's just like a grievance. It's just someone saying, the rent is too high. But the truth is that if you look at the data in big cities, rents have been skyrocketing now for the last couple of decades, and increasingly so, the burdens of being low income in big cities is becoming too much, and people are being squeezed out. Now, these are individuals who still have jobs in the city, so they, in a sense, need to be in the city, but they're being pushed further and further and further out. Their commute times get really large, or in some circumstances, people can even be pushed out and into homelessness because rents are spiraling up too quickly, and they don't have any necessarily other place to go. We forget that sometimes, that if someone gets pushed out of their home because they can't afford it, it isn't necessarily the case that they can very easily move into a new situation. In fact, it can be quite difficult. So while historically this may have been like a normative position, it seems a little odd for us to not acknowledge that, of course, rents have been skyrocketing, and almost, of course, that's not necessarily good. We can look at that as an economic outcome, but we can also see that rent spiraling up in a sort of out of control fashion has certain social detriments, has certain social costs, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to give up economics in order to acknowledge that if a systemic number of people are unable to afford rent and are getting pushed out of neighborhoods and communities, especially if there are cultural significances that society benefits from if they are maintained, then this is certainly something that is an economic issue, one. And it's also not necessarily normative in the sense that it could very well be argued that rent inequality is an economic problem. And you don't even necessarily need to sort of develop a value judgment towards it, necessarily, right? That clearly it would be in society's best interest if people could afford to live, near where they worked, or at least to some extent people can just afford to live in dwellings. And if that is problematic for larger numbers of people, again, I don't think that we need to necessarily adhere to the sort of positivist dogma of historical economics. So in this course, again, we will delve into those particular topics, and we'll explore, when is policy help, and when might policy in fact be detrimental. There isn't a sense that just because we point out a social problem that there necessarily needs to be policy to fix it. And we'll certainly look at certain circumstances where policy may make things worse, and then a whole host of other issues where policy certainly can make things a lot better.